What's going on, everybody? My name is Brycearonee, and welcome to the Bryce is Right. I'm a guy who believes in promoting positive atheism and secular humanism. Today, joining me will be Jesus mythicist David Fitzgerald. David is the author of Nailed 10 Christian Myths That Show Jesus Never Existed at All, as well as its follow up, Jesus Mything in Action, which is part of his complete Heretics Guide to Western Religion series. So, David, come on down. Welcome. You are my next guest on The Bryce is Right. How you doing?
Bryce, I hate to say it, but I think we're having some audio problems. Are
Oh,
you
can
hearing
you
me
hear me
okay?
okay?
Your voice is super deep and super slow motion.
That sounds like an internet connectivity issue, but you're coming in loud and clear and crystal on my end. Let me bring in producer Wes via audio to see if which one of us is having the problem. So, hey Wes, can you hear David okay?
I can hear him okay. You are really slow to sounding to me too. So
Okay, so tell you what I'm going to do. I am going to back out and then come right back in to see if that clears it up. Stay tuned for just 1 second, guys.
okay, David, why don't you go ahead and start giving an intro for yourself if you want? Kind of tell us who you are and.
Are you guys hearing me okay?
Yeah. Yep. We hear you, David.
Okay. Yeah, bear with me because I'm barely understanding anything that's being said from this end, I'm afraid.
Can you hear me, David?
I can hear you, but you sound like the Jolly Green Giant on mushrooms.
I wonder if that has something to do with your Bluetooth, because I'm looking in the comment section on YouTube, and everyone is saying that we both sound good, and you sound good to me. So it sounds like me sounding good to you is the issue. So can you disconnect your Bluetooth? That might help.
Again, apologies. I think I'm just guessing that you're asking me to give an introduction about myself right now.
We
Give me a
were,
nod. Okay.
but if you reset your
Yeah.
Bluetooth, you might be able to hear us better.
Okay. And again, I apologize. I cannot make out a single word's being said, but we can muddle through it if you want. So my name is Dave Fitzgerald, and in that I'm well known at all, it's known for the books that I've done, mostly on atheist history and mostly on the Jesus historicity issue, arguing whether or not Jesus was an actual person. And what I usually start out by saying is like 20 plus years ago, it never even crossed my mind to question Jesus's historicity. And it wasn't until I got curious to know, well, when you're reading the four Gospels, which really is our only original biographical information for Jesus, everything else is based off of those. You get four different Jesuses depending on who's telling the story. And I remember as an atheist, Christian turned atheist, wanting to know if there was a way we could parse out what was the real Jesus from what was a legendary creation that just piled on over the centuries after that. And so, again, it never crossed my mind to think there was no Jesus whatsoever until I started trying to separate out the real Jesus from the legendary Jesus. And long story short, all these red flags started popping up almost immediately. And about 2 years into that search, I started thinking, I don't think this guy existed at all, which, to be honest, blew my mind as much as losing my religion had 16 years earlier. But when we look at what we know and what what our sources are for Jesus, they almost immediately fall into question. And there's some serious discrepancies between, for instance, Christianity, the way Paul and those early generation of Christians talked about Jesus, and the way everybody starts talking about Jesus once Mark writes his gospel.
Well, before we get into that, I want you to tell us a little bit about what you used to believe and how you came to be an atheist. So the question is, what is your religious background, and when did you become an atheist?
Gotcha. Again, I apologize. Didn't make out a word of that, but I'm reading from the chat. What was my
We're
religious
gonna
background?
make it through. We're gonna make it through.
When did I become an atheist? I was raised Southern Baptist, and from a very young age, basically, I grew up as a Southern Baptist. And it wasn't until college that, I mean, I was a true believer all the way down the line. People thought I was going to become a preacher. And it all started, my downfall started with this girl I was flirting with. And the way we would flirt with each other is we would have theological arguments with each other. And so one day we're going at it. I always give the standard evangelical Christian answer, and she would give some hippy dippy Renaissance fair, leftist answer. And she goes, well, Dave, the Hindu religion is like 3,000 years older than Christianity. And I was all set to jump down her case and go, no, it's not. And before I could get a word out of my mouth, I realized I had no idea whether Hinduism was even older than Christianity or not. And I was all ready to tell her something that I didn't know if it was true or not. And that moment, the lightning hit me, and I realized I'm just like the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons. I'm just parroting back what I'd been taught. And, if you're old enough to be Talking Heads fans, there's a great song David Barron does where he says, am I right or am I wrong? My God, what have I done? And I swear he was on my shoulder that time, because from that moment on, it never occurred to me to question this faith that I've been raised in. But as soon as I did, it just instantly felt fake. And I know Christian friends of mine and ex-clergymen who talk about this long drag from step to step to step to step until they finally become an atheist. But I feel like I can tell you the pinpoint moment when I was a true believer, and to where it's like, wait, what am I doing here? This is obviously fake. And it was never the same after that. So bizarre.
So I'm wondering, at what point did you go from atheist to Christ is completely a myth?
Good question. When did I come to the realization that Christ was just a myth? There were some red flags that popped up almost immediately. And in my book, Nailed, the first book, the paradox that I give at the end is I say, either Jesus did all these amazing things, these miraculous things, or at very least taught all these amazing new things, and yet no one seems to notice outside his cult for a century or more. Or he didn't do these things, didn't teach these amazing things, and yet as soon as he's dead, we have all these feuding little house cults that worship him, not just in the Galilee, not just in Jerusalem, but all over the Roman Empire, scattered all over the Roman Empire. And as we read in Paul's letters, they don't agree much on what being a Christian is, or who Jesus was, or what he did. And that's kind of the main thing that really stuck in my craw at first. I have a chapter in the book Nailed that says, can Jesus be saved? And I talk about all the ways that the New Testament would be different, that the Gospels would be different, that early Christian history would be different if Jesus was just a mere mortal dude, because let's face it, there's nothing implausible about Jesus being just one more failed apocalyptic prophet. There's nothing implausible about it. Nothing. I don't think people are stupid for thinking that he was just a normal guy who actually existed, or maybe even a compilation of several different guys, because there was plenty of figures like him. But I don't think that's where our evidence goes. And again, you don't have to be an atheist to think that. You don't have to think that to be an atheist. It's just, the only reason I argue it is because that seems to me to be the best answer to certain problems that aren't answered by anything else in history.
Interesting.
In Christian history, I should say.
David is doing a good job of anticipating my questions. So my next question will be, are you the majority or the minority in atheism?
First of all, thank goodness we have this crawl down here, or this would be such a really disaster of an interview.
I figured it out beforehand. So
does your position represent the majority within atheism, or is it a minority viewpoint? It is such a minority viewpoint. The thing that makes me laugh, though, is that Christians love throwing that in our face, that, oh, even most atheists don't believe that. But they do that a lot less in the 7 years since I wrote Jesus, Mything in Action. When I wrote Nailed, I wasn't surprised by the reaction from Christians, but I was a little surprised by the reaction to atheists. And no, I didn't expect everybody to be on board with it. But I mean, I didn't expect it to like wave the red flags for people it does, because it took me a while to figure it out. But I think what happens is people lump together Jesus mythicism with Earth, being flat, Holocaust denial, pseudo history of every kind, pseudoscience. And I think our fellow atheists would be a lot more reassured if they realize that, A, I'm not dogmatic about this. It's no skin off my back if there was a real Jesus. It's not like Christianity is suddenly going to start making sense if he was just an ordinary failed apocalyptic prophet. But again, that's not where our evidence goes. And the more we look at it, the more questions arise. And even Christian scholars have talked about this problem, that the more we study Jesus, the less we know about him, and the more there's bizarre incongruencies that don't add up to the official story of Jesus. And it's not even a question of just silence, an argument from silence, but it's the way they talk about Jesus and the way they don't talk about Jesus, the things they say and the things they don't say, and the things they're not aware of. And there's a whole slew, so much that when I wrote Nailed, I wrote Jesus, Mything in Action, which is actually 3 books, just to answer the pushback I'd get from our fellow atheists, and talk about the problems with our Gospels, the problem with the rest of the New Testament and early Christian history.
Yeah, there's that book that he was just talking about. I have not had a chance to read them, but I know Richard Carrier, who is a mythicist, has a similar position.
Yeah.
Atheists don't really have a dog in the fight. So it doesn't matter if Jesus is a myth or not, basically.
Right. Richard Carrier says that. Bart Ehrman also says that he has no dog in the hunt, which is funny because he's such a staunch historicist. He's one of the best mythicist writers out there. And I've been saying that for years, because all the things that he's uncovered about forgery in Christianity and counter-forgery, the orthodox corruption of scripture, all his awesome books. And I'm a huge Bart Ehrman fan. But when it comes to mythicism, he's got this huge blind spot. And he doesn't seem to be, all his arguments now seem to be straw men based on stuff he read in the 90s or the 80s. And doesn't seem to be anything that mythicists, the serious mythicists, there's crackpot mythicists out there for sure, are actually arguing. And I think specifically, he says things like all mythicists don't believe that Nazareth existed in the early 1st century, or that they think that, or he insists that Paul knew Jesus' brother. And it's like, there's serious problems with assuming that the guy Paul is talking about is Jesus' brother, or that the other leaders of Jerusalem church are his apostles. And again, I've got 4 books on hand talking about that, to break that down. But I think maybe one of my biggest problems with Bart Ehrman is that when he wrote his book, Did Jesus Exist?, mythicists like me weren't disappointed with it because we expected him to agree with us. We were disappointed with it because we thought this was going to be the best defense of historicity and clear all these bad mythicist theories out there. just clear the deadwood. But he didn't even do that. And for someone who's written such amazing books, I think he just phoned it in and has never really taken the subject seriously. For one thing, he lumps all the different mythicist theories together and doesn't seem to realize that, no, there's peer-reviewed mythicists out there, and they're saying very different things than what the crackpots are saying.
Well, I would love to get Mr. Ehrman on my show if he would agree to come on, but I'm curious about mythicism being the minority. Will this become more popular as it ages?
I'm reading, will the mythicist position become more popular as it ages?
You got it.
You know, to be honest, I don't really think so. I think it's always going to be a minority position, and I talk about that in Jesus Mything in Action, why that is, because the historical biblical studies, Jesus studies, that's always been predominantly Christian based, either Catholic, Protestant, but religiously affiliated. And that's not even weird when you think about it for 5 minutes. So the question isn't how many scholars believe in mythicism or don't believe in mythicism. It's how many of them are contractually obligated to not believe in mythicism. And even that's kind of not even the point, because there are secular scholars like Bart Ehrman. But one of the things I've noticed, especially recently, is that he seems to be afraid of changing his mind about this. And I don't know if it's an ego thing. I know he and Carrier both have massive egos. I love them both. They both have massive egos, and they butted heads. And I don't think either one will ever be at a point where they can sit down and have a good discussion together about the situation, about the issue. Though Carrier has done some really great analysis of the debate that Robert Bryce and Bart Ehrman had. And I think that's worth reading. It makes the debate, which is problematic in lots of ways, worth having when you see the analysis that came out of that.
Yeah, and I think both of them would probably resist
short,
because their reputation could be on the line.
And it's kind of ironic that he makes so much fun of these straw men and doesn't engage with the peer-reviewed stuff. It's like, yeah, I can understand why he wouldn't read a book like mine, for instance, or any number of those like Joseph Atwill, who says that Jesus was invented by Flavius Josephus as a Roman tool. It's like there's lots and lots of problems with that kind of theory. And I don't think Bart realizes that people like Robert Bryce and Richard Carrier and myself, we're as hard or harder on those fringe mythicist theories than we are on the peer-reviewed stuff. And for instance, Raphael Lattister, who is a relevant PhD in New Zealand or Australia. Oh, forgive me, Raphael, I forget which one you're from. He's pointed out a lot of the problems that Bart has just by making these presuppositions, these presumptions that don't turn out to be founded. And I've noticed his writing since Did Jesus Exist? You see him backing away from things that he thought earlier were much firmly founded on. And I think you can, there's so many examples of that, not just on Bart's case, but of Christian evangelicals making claims about the historical Jesus that are just totally not founded on anything but wishful thinking.
So we did get a question from my producer, actually, and the question is, what did you think of the Christian writer John Christie, whom you've debated?
I like him as a person. We like each other very much. I haven't seen him in ages, actually. He did a movie called My Week in Atheism that I appeared in, and I wonder if that's the debate that our producer Wes was talking about earlier that he has seen me do.
Yeah.
I've kind of backed away from doing debates, not because I'm not good at them, but I really seriously question how useful they are. And it seems like the Q&A is where everything, all the heavy lifting really gets done. Because if you're having a discussion with somebody, then there's a whole different dynamic to when you're having a debate with somebody. And this is nothing against John Christie at all, but I'm kind of tired about debating Christians over this particular aspect. I'll debate them about other things if they want, but my biggest interest is in the Jesus mythicist question. And that's something that Christians, they cannot even give an inch on. You know, they can take evolution and find ways to, you know, massage it and work it and make it fit in with their Christianity. Some of them can anyway, but you can't do that with Jesus mythicism. We can do that. We can just have an intellectual curiosity and not really care one way or the other, be agnostic about it, but they can't even have that. They have to. We don't need Jesus to be a myth, but they need Jesus to not be a myth.
Right. I was talking about that actually, and I'm going to ask you more about that. But first, let me take a moment to acknowledge some of the people that we have in the chat, as I customarily do. I see that we have John Christian, theoretically, Megan Santanas. Thank you for joining me. Bible Burner, Secular Rarity, Aunt Kathy, whom I love. Who else? We've got Producer West in the background. We've got Kat the Humanist, theoretically, and who else? Any other new names? Titan Uranus. That is not a new name, but it's a name that I enjoy saying. We've got B, no just B. Welcome. And who else? Anybody else? I apologize if I've missed your name. Oh, John Hudson. There you go. Cool. So once again, guys, I thank you for tuning into the show. Sorry about the audio difficulties we're having, but we're going to try to get through it as best we can. Now, back to some of my questions. I guess the next question to be asked is there sufficient evidence to warrant belief in Jesus based on the impact of Christianity? Christianity is so big, surely there must be someone who existed, no?
You know, it's funny. One of the side effects of looking into the Jesus historicity issue is I would have Buddhists come up to me and say, you know what? We're having the same debates in our circles about whether the Buddha actually existed. And ex-Muslims would come up to me and say, you know what? We're having the same debates in our circle if Muhammad actually existed. And that blew my mind. And
it's
so
to be
much
expected,
so,
but yeah,
so much so that recently, this last year, I've been doing several talks about the evolution of world religions, not just Christianity, but all of them. The evolution of religion and the historicity of all the founder figures of all the major world religions. And I didn't go into it expecting this to be true. And again, it's doesn't mean that all religions are fake, but it turns out that every single one of the top 10 religions and a couple other ones like Zoroastrianism and Baha'is and Mormons, there's serious backstory problems with their founder figures. Every single world religion, Western, Eastern, across the board. So much so that I'm going to be writing a short book about that, just pointing out, here's the problems we have with everybody. I just did I don't know if you've seen the book that just came out from John Loftus and Robert Price, The Varieties of Mythicism. I contributed the opening chapter of that called Does Mythicism Matter? And I just a kind of a brief overview of all the arguments that try to shut down the argument, the discussion before it gets started, and saying, look, whether there was a Jesus or not, whether Christianity is true or not, these are the historical facts, and they don't look good for Jesus. And everything we learn in this debate between the historicists who are sure there was a Jesus of some sort and the mythicists who are pretty sure there was no Jesus of any kind, everything we learn in that back and forth helps us better cope with Christian apologetics. specifically anybody who tells you they know how Jesus wants you to think or behave or vote. And if nothing else, if absolutely nothing else, that's a good thing for all of us to know.
Well, I have to say that my
So-
position has flipped. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, so long story short, to answer that question, no, just the bare fact that you have a religion doesn't necessarily mean that its official story holds up. And it seems like the norm is just the opposite, that it's normal for major world religions to start with a purely imaginary founder figure, and all those writings come together later. And we could talk all night just about that. But
yeah, anyone who's
stay
been
tuned for the
watching
next
my
book.
show long enough knows that I flip-flopped on this position. I'm now consider myself a mythicist. Before, I considered myself a person who believed he actually existed. So I flip-flop in between. But the question is, can the Bible be used as evidence? Can we say that someone existed because the Bible indicates a real person's name?
Yeah, I'm reading the crawl. And that's an excellent question, actually. Can it be used as evidence to support mundane claims? And the truth of the matter is, it's not just the miracles that are under question. It's even the mundane, mere mortal things that happen in the Gospels. And I'll give you some examples of that. A lot of people say, oh, but the Gospels are so detailed about this week and this happened and this happened. And it's like, yeah, they're all very detailed, but they don't agree with each other's details, which are just as detailed. For instance, Jesus' nativity, half the Gospels have no nativity story. The two that do aren't telling the same story at all. And when you just have to read Matthew's story and then Luke's story and realize there's no way these two even are set in the same time, let alone could match up in all the details. Jesus' death, his execution, his trial, Jewish scholars have been pointing out problems with the whole setup of that for generations. The trial account of Jesus makes no sense at all, according to what we know, everything we know about Jewish law. For instance, the high priest acting as the prosecuting attorney. That would never happen for the simple reason that Jewish trials didn't have prosecuting attorneys. So these are all these kind of things.
Wow.
And yet every aspect of that trial that we get in Mark, that's expanded on in the other Gospels, everything about that makes perfect sense allegorically, symbolically, mystically, as someone taking the Yom Kippur ceremony in Judaism and making an allegory of it. Then it matches up point by point by point. Historically, it makes no sense. We know about Pontius Pilate not from the Gospels, but from historians of the time. And nothing that we know about Pontius Pilate from history matches the figure we get in any of the Gospels. And nothing he does makes any sense historically either. So
I didn't even consider that argument.
Tail wagging the dog things. It's like the historical tidbits that we get in the Gospels, we can see what sources they're from. They're from things like Josephus. Like Luke loves to name drop celebrities from the first century into his stories, but he often gets it wrong. And that's one of the reasons that we know that he's borrowing from Josephus and not the other way around. And incidentally, that's also how we know that he couldn't have written his gospel before the year 93 or 94, and is probably written quite a bit after that.
And I didn't even consider some of the arguments you just made, but it really would require some knowledge of ancient Jewish customs to figure out that they had it wrong.
Right. And also the same is true with Roman customs and Greek. If as a reader, we're familiar with Greek and we're familiar with Greek literature, like the Odyssey and Homer and all, a lot of the tropes and the puns and the really very on the nose named characters and places in the Gospels really show up much stronger. And it's much more obvious that this is not meant to be taken literally when you know a little bit about that. Yeah.
So we do have a question from the chat. This is from John Christian. What sort of arguments do you get from non-theists?
from non-theists. Probably the most common one that everyone seems to focus on is in the letter to Galatians. Paul mentions that he didn't talk to any apostles. He only talked to James, the brother of the Lord. And there's been lots of discussion on, is that him talking about James? Did he think James was Jesus's brother? And there's lots of problems with that, not least of which is just a few verses later, he's talking about the entire leadership of the Jerusalem church, James, Peter, John, and treating them like they're not even real Christians. Like he didn't give it to them for a moment. He's opposing them throughout the book of Galatians. He even opposes Peter / Cephas face to face. And it's really weird that he would think that this person was Jesus' brother and this other guy here was Jesus' number one disciple when he thinks they're not even real Christians. And in fact, when you read Paul's letters without looking at through a gospel lens, there's lots of things that are being read into it by people who read it. For instance, Paul never says that these guys are Jesus' disciples. He never says Jesus had disciples. He never uses the word disciples ever in any context. And there's lots of other things he does talk about where he's talking about a celestial Jesus who does all these things before the creation of the world or in heaven. And basically there's nothing that he says that can be tied to anything an earthly Jesus said. And so much that we get from the Gospels that he seems completely unaware of, even when it would totally make the point he's trying to make at the time, or even when he's disagreeing with what Jesus said. And often in the Gospels, what we find Jesus saying is not coming from what Jesus said, or sorry, Paul's not saying anything that came from Jesus. Jesus is saying things that came from Paul.
So, which brings me to my next question, and I like to have people on to talk about this whenever they're mythicists. Is it possible that Jesus made up Paul? Or rather, that Paul made up Jesus, sorry.
Yeah, that's a very timely question. And it's a great question. Personally, I don't think Jesus is entirely made up by Paul, because Paul didn't create Christianity. He was just one of many evangelists who read the Jewish scriptures, felt that Jesus' spirit was speaking to them through those scriptures, and claimed to have either visions or revelations. He never tells us anything like the road to Damascus story, never says anything remotely like that. He seems to make it sound like it's all from his Bible study and the word of God speaking to his ear from that.
Interesting.
The thing about Paul that's interesting, and by interesting, I mean, it's really weird, no matter how you slice Christianity, whether Christianity is true or not, this is weird, that of the whole first century, just about, the only guy that we actually have any writings from for that whole time is Paul. We don't have any real church history. We just have the bullshit church history that's in Acts. We don't have anything really by Peter or any of the disciples. We just have letters that were written generations later, forged in their name. And even those letters, James and Jude, who are supposedly brothers of Jesus, they mention that he's James' brother, and James mentions he's Jude's brother, and vice versa. But neither of them mentions that they're Jesus' brother. So there's lots of bizarre things like that. And again, in Jesus Mything in Action, I talk about that it's not just the silences, but it's the things they actually do say about their Jesus and about early Christianity, saying things, having to defend themselves against charges like, oh, we didn't follow cleverly designed fables. We actually saw this with our own eyes. And then they give a fake eyewitness report that's really taken from the Old Testament. They're constantly punting to the Old Testament as if that's the voice of Jesus speaking to them. And we see that not just in the New Testament, but in early church fathers like Clement of Rome, where he quotes Jesus saying things, but his quotes aren't anything in the gospel. They're from the Old Testament.
So I'm sorry, go ahead. Did you have more to add? I will take that as a no. So I'll move on to my next question. By the way, if you guys in the chat have any comments or questions, please leave them and I will highlight them. So my question is, after I get finished typing it so he can see it, is Jesus necessary for morality? I can't spell. There we go. There we go.
Was Jesus necessary for morality? Well, that's kind of a weird question from a historical standpoint. It seems like you needed a figure to hang your hat on. And so for wisdom, we have Solomon. For fables, we have Aesop. For Proverbs, we have Confucius. We see that kind of thing where you've got a figure and they become this repository of all the things, the ideas that people liked at the time. And with Jesus, you see him, it's funny because the Gospels say things like, oh, he didn't teach like the scribes and the Pharisees. He taught this new way. It was like, no, that's completely wrong. Some of his teachings come directly from the Pharisees. In fact, the Pharisees would have loved somebody like Jesus because they hated those fat cats who ran the temple and were toadies to the Romans just as much as Jesus does in the Gospels. That there's an anachronism there because by the time Christianity was going and by the time the Gospels were written in the late part of the first century or the early part of the second century, the Pharisees, they were the Jewish authorities by that time. And they were in cahoots, or not in cahoots, but they were in conflict with the Christians. But a real Jesus, as presented in the gospel, is somebody who the Pharisees would have loved. They would have really been totally behind him. And that depiction of Pharisees as being these snooty, hypocritical law guys is taken from their enemies, the Sadducees, who they hated just as much.
So I like that you use that term there because I use in cahoots all the time. But this is an argument I get from atheists sometimes, the ones who think it's a waste of time to be a mythicist. Is it a waste of time? And should we just grant that he existed so that we can get to the supernatural claims?
You know, that's a good question. And believe me, as a writer, you're often beating yourself against the wall when you come across the same lame old chestnut thrown back at you and realize these guys have clearly never read your book. Is it a waste of time? I don't think it's a waste of time to debate it with fellow atheists. And when Nailed came out in 2010, again, I got lots of weird pushback from atheists. In 2017, 7 years later, when Jesus Mything in Action came out, the reaction was more like to be, oh yeah, I never thought there was a Jesus. It's like, where were you 7 years ago? So that's just, you know, in less than 10 years, there's been some really interesting changes in the discussion. And I see that on the Christian side, that they've ramped up their apologetics to try to address the fact that the evidence for Jesus is so bad. And again, I can't emphasize this enough. The evidence for Jesus is horrible, whether there was a real Jesus or not, whether Christianity is true or not. The evidence for him is just awful, really, really bad. So in that sense, I don't think it's a waste of time. And
Okay.
what's more, it's fascinating. It's fascinating to me to see the evolution of this big enchilada we call Christianity, where it came from. It really kind of blows my mind, and it's fun. It's fun. So no, it's not a waste of time. It is a waste of time to argue it with Christians, I think, in my humble opinion. I think there's better use of argument. It's enough for them to know that atheists doubt that Jesus existed, and if they want to get into it, sure. But I don't use that as my opener.
Yeah. And for me, I guess it just depends on which theist that I'm talking to. But This is going to be an interesting question. It's about Josephus, who you mentioned earlier. Do his writings count as extra biblical evidence for the existence of Jesus? And I'm talking about the Testimonium Flavinium, which is the book where he talks about Jesus.
Yeah. Josephus is really the only, when I talked about in Nailed all the different eyewitnesses for Jesus, there's a lot that are claimed for Jesus. I've heard preachers say, oh, there's about 50 different witnesses you could use for Jesus. So not true. They boil down to about 17 that have any kind of credibility, but when you put them on a timeline, none of them even come close to being contemporary with Jesus at all. Most of them aren't even in the first century. And the one that comes the closest is a Jewish historian named Flavius Josephus, who wrote in the 90s. He was born after Jesus was meant to have died, so he's not contemporary with Jesus at all. Not unlike somebody like Philo of Alexandria, who was there before, after, during, and after Jesus. But the reason that we even talk about Josephus when we talk about Jesus is because there's two passages, and the Testimonium is one of them, where he seems to be talking about Jesus. And I say he seems to be. No one argues that this passage is not a forgery. There's no way it is not a forgery. But the way the field goals have shifted over the years is that Christians try to say, well, it's only a partial forgery, and that there was really something written about Jesus in Josephus. And there's so many problems with that I spend a whole chapter just talking about that.
Maybe this next question leads into that, so I might as well ask it here. Do all modern scholars reject the authenticity of Josephus's writings?
Well, here's the thing. Yes, that's an interpolation. And we have good reason to think that it's a complete interpolation, not some partial one, or not based, that there's not some original that people are based on. For one thing, one problem is, for 300 years after his book was written, no Christian, and ancient Christians loved reading Josephus. No one seems to know about this passage, except for one guy 300 years later, Eusebius. And for 200 years after him, nobody knows about this passage until Jerome. So that's half a millennia where only one guy seems to know it. And he got his copy of Josephus's books from one of the Christian church fathers who complains that Josephus never talks about Jesus, And again, that's just one reason, there's a lot. So we don't even have to reject the authenticity of all of Josephus's writings, but clearly that one is not. And I mentioned there were two of them. There's another passage about James, the so-called brother of the Lord. That the brother of the Lord part seems to be an interpretation and or just a scribal note that got put into the text. And the reason I say that is because it makes no sense at all, the story that they're telling, if it's about an early church Christian leader who was supposed to be Jesus's brother. It makes no sense at all. It makes perfect sense if it's about the Jesus who's actually mentioned in the story, Jesus ben Damnius, son of Damnius. And I'm a little shocked that, I'm not just surprised that Christians still trot that out, but I am shocked that atheists seem to think that they're impressed with that being real, because all you have to do is read the passage and it's like, oh, that's who they're talking about. And that's the one that makes sense. But here, I get why Christians need to, because if the testimonium is interpolated as a complete forgery, which it is, and the other one isn't even about our Jesus, that means for the entire first century, we have nothing outside the Gospels to corroborate these Gospel stories. Nothing outside the New Testament at all. That's a pretty remarkable situation.
So one of the arguments that I get from Christians is that they're trying to build a cumulative case. In other words, they're taking many pieces of evidence and saying this should be enough to conclude that a Jesus existed. What do you think about that argument? Can we make a cumulative case that there had to be somebody?
Okay, if I'm understanding you right, and I'm doing it between what I thought you said and what the crawl says.
Don't listen to me, read the words.
One of these days, I'm gonna have to give you an impression of what it sounds like on your end, because it's just it's.
Oh, I'm sure I'll hear the end of it.
And we were so good before the show started. Oh, crystal
know.
clear. But can a cumulative case of weak evidences be made in favor? Well, again, there's nothing implausible about Jesus being just another failed apocalyptic prophet. It
Mhm.
is weird that he was the only one that had this religion spring up overnight about him and takes another 100 years to get its facts straight about him. But one thing about that idea is that we do have evidence for wandering preachers and wandering wannabe messiahs at the time. And every one of them made a dent in the historical record, even though nothing they do is anywhere near as interesting as what Jesus does in the Gospels. So it's kind of a catch-22 for Christians. It's like, well, if you think Jesus did all these amazing things, how come nobody noticed? And yet they noticed these losers over here who didn't do anything half as remarkable, even a fraction of remarkable. Even John the Baptist. And again, there's some really interesting problems with the John the Baptist, his cult, his religion, his sect, and early Christianity. It's obvious that they were fighting each other at least until the 2nd century before it got domesticated and turned into Christianity. But John the Baptist, the evidence for him is slightly better than Jesus too. Not so much that it wouldn't shock me if John the Baptist turned out to be completely mythical too. But if I had to bet on one or the other, I bet John the Baptist was real and Jesus was not.
Wow. That's okay. So I can't wait to get you on the show again so that we can have a proper discussion and dig into this. But let's talk about the Mormons. You also wrote a book about Mormons. Is Joseph Smith a myth?
Yeah. Well, okay, here's the thing though. Is Joseph Smith the founder of Mormonism? No. It's the Book of Mormon. The prophet Mormon is the founder of Mormonism. Or unless you want to, this guy on the cover, the Angel Moroni, you can make an argument that either of those two are the founders of Mormonism. Joseph's just the translator. See, he's the conduit. He's the messenger. And it just goes to show you that to Mormons, there was a Joseph Smith. And if you've seen the Myth Vision podcast, Bryce Blankenagel from Naked Mormonism and I did a series called The Secret History of Mormonism, where we talked about all the stuff that was going on in Joseph Smith's early career. And when Derek Lambert asked us to do it for Myth Vision, we thought, well, yeah, we can probably do, 5 episodes, 8 episodes, maybe 10 episodes. And I think when we finally ended, we never even barely got to Utah before we were on episode like 28 or 29. So we're kind of going down a rabbit hole now, but Joseph Smith was real. L. Ron Hubbard was real, but Xenu is not real. Mormon is not real. And none of the other founder figures in the major world religions, the big boys, none of them seem to be real either.
So let me ask you to dig into that a little bit more. Is Mormonism a cult? Because I often hear it described that way by other Christians, but I'm not sure if I can tell the difference. So which one is it?
Yeah, that's one of those questions that Christians are more interested in defining who's a cult and who's a real legit religion.
True.
And so, I mean, when I think of a cult, are they small? Are they powerless? Are they super high controlling? That's kind of my default. And yeah, they are kind of controlling. They're super controlling. And I think for me, that's what separates a cult from a church. But churches can be bona fide, widely accepted branches of Christianity can be every bit as controlling as the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Mormons or fill in the blank.
Right.
Yeah.
Speaking of Jehovah's Witnesses, will you be writing about them anytime soon?
In theory, I am working on a book on the Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm working on 2 books right now: Sex and Violence in the Bible and Jehovah's
I like
Witnesses.
it.
and I'm much more excited about the Sex and Violence in the Bible book, to be honest, because I've gotten great responses from former Jehovah's Witnesses, but holy crap, they're just so sad and depressing. It's like Mormonism, say what you want about Mormonism, it's like steampunk Scientology. It is crazy, wackadoodle, strap yourselves in, you will not believe this. HBO should make a mini series about this religion because there's just so much sex and violence and just freaking craziness. And by contrast, Jehovah's Witness just seems like a Sunday school program that went really, really bad and it turned into a controlling cult. And I haven't really found a way to turn that into something that I think people want to read. So I may, if I can find approach, originally I was going to do fun with Jehovah's Witnesses and like make it a manual to when they knock on your door, how to engage with them. And maybe something like that will come down the road. But it's tricky. It's tricky business. But the Sex and Violence book, oh man, you are so going to love that book.
Oh yeah.
It's just,
I'll be the first customer. So you mentioned Loftus and Price earlier. Have you ever worked with them, and would you consider doing it in the future?
Well, in a sense, I already have, because they asked me to contribute a chapter to this last anthology of theirs, Varieties of Mythicism. But in fact, I do work with Price quite a bit. He asked me to do book reviews for the Journal of Higher Criticism, and I've reviewed several books for that. And John Loftus, he and I are big fans. It looks like he's saying he's finished writing books, and I hope that's not wrong. I hope that's wrong, because I think he's made some amazing anthologies that are just must-reads. But I mean, honestly, being an atheist author can be a real drag, and I don't blame anybody for saying, look, I served my time. It's tricky because you're writing, so you don't see your audience as much, especially now in the post-pandemic days when there's no conventions for you to go to and engage with people in person. So it can be very isolating, and you're not sure how it's being received. It's if it weren't for social media, it'd be even more of a shot in the dark. Yeah, I don't want to make it sound like I'm complaining or make me feel bad for Dave, but it's tough to make a living out of that for sure. And
yeah, and you guys, if you've seen my interview with John Loftus, he did mention that he is kind of done writing. He's got one or two more at the time of that interview, so I don't know. Hopefully he changes his mind. But I heard you were into science fiction. Is that true?
Nice segue. Yeah.
Thank you.
Being a science fiction writer is another one that can be a roll of the dice when it comes to making money. But yeah, my wife and I wrote a trilogy, the Time Shards trilogy, and the third book just came out last year. It's super fun, super fun. Normally, I tell people, like, when you're writing a nonfiction book, you have to do your citations. You got to do research. You've got to do footnotes. Everything's got to be done in a certain way to a certain standard just to get the history right. Fiction, you don't have to do any of that, but you have to make everything up. When you write a book like Time Shards is a science fiction time travel post-apocalyptic mashup. The conceit of the book is that the timeline shatters, and suddenly the Earth is in all these different jigsaw pieces, basically, where these people are wandering around from all the main characters are from different times. There's a girl from modern San Diego, a first century Celt, some World War II folks, some Victorians, and
That's cool.
other times. And you don't know if you're going to bump into a dinosaur around the corner or a robot from the future. It's super, super fun. But I had to do as much research on this book as I did for any other historical book I've ever done. And we had to make it all up ourselves too. So
right. I'm excited about that for sure.
I'm super proud of the way it turned out.
Okay, and I had to ask you
it
this
was fun.
question.
Star Trek or Star Wars? Don't make me choose. I mean, I was old school for both. It's like I stood in line to watch the first Star Wars. I grew up on Star Trek.
Me too.
Now both franchises have blown up so much I can't even keep up with both of them, with either of them. And there's Doctor Who. I haven't even got a chance to break into Doctor Who. So, yeah.
Well, let me just ask you this. Maybe this will be easier. What's your favorite science fiction series and/or films?
Okay, we're still in dangerous pick your favorite child thing, but some of my favorite series. I was really into cyberpunk in the 80s, and a lot of the cyberpunk authors I'm still really fond of. Lately, I've been reading Annalee Nevitz. She wrote what is it? Stories from Another Timeline, which is a really cool book. I'm blanking. As far as science fiction films, this is not a popular answer, but one of my favorite science fiction films of all time might just have to be The Fifth Element. As silly as it is, it's just this big, lush hamburger movie, and I kind of love it. Of course, Blade Runner, and I really like what they've done with the new Dune very much.
Yeah, it's a great movie. So my last question was, give us the name of your book one more time, and tell us when it's going to be available.
Will do. And thank goodness for this crawl. So Time Shards is both the first book in the series and the name of the trilogy itself. And just 3 books, but it's a great, especially for atheists. I don't hit people over the head with atheism, but I love throwing people from different times and places together. So you get like medieval Muslims rubbing shoulders with pagan Celts and early Christians and late Christians, and just letting those ideas that they all have play off each other. I really try to do a good job of making all the characters true to what they would have been, and let their what am I trying to say? It always annoys me when you have a series like Hercules where it's supposed to be in the ancient world, and yet they're all talking like they're from San Dimas and they're all surfer dudes, I wanted them to think differently and show things from their viewpoint, and still make them people you can either root for or not like, not necessarily based on what their religion is or isn't. And the beautiful thing about science fiction is just by posting another world, another alternate way things could be, you're already challenging Christianity, because there's no rules and there's clearly no God running the show.
Maybe that's why I've always loved science fiction.
I think atheists will enjoy it.
Yeah. So, we have reached the top of the hour. I had to improvise because of our audio troubles, but thank you so much, David Fitzgerald, for joining us. I have to have you back sometime, but I appreciate you coming on to the show.
Thanks for having me, and I can't wait to do it again.
Absolutely. And ladies and gentlemen, if you have enjoyed this week's show, do me a favor and hit the like and subscribe button. Let me switch it to myself so David knows that I'm no longer talking to him. I had to improvise my way through this show, so I apologize about that. Technology happens, right? But if you like the interview, at least hit the like button, subscribe to Tang, the Atheist Network group, for more awesome secular content. My show comes on Tuesdays at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And for producer Oz, producer Wes, and producer Sunny Shell, my name is Brycearonee. Have a good morning, a good afternoon, and a good night. I'll see you guys next time on The Bryce is Right.